You're using stencils all wrong, and this one simple trick will completely change the way you craft. When using stencils, more often than not, you're simply ink blending over top, and that's totally fine. Maybe you get adventurous and add some embossing paste over top of the stencil. These are beautiful looks, but they're very one-dimensional. Many crafters don't realize that they can take stenciling to the next level by combining heat embossing with techniques like emboss resist or multicolored powders or Joseph's coat.
So let's make a few cards together, remind ourselves of some great heat embossing techniques with stencils, and then also talk about the biggest mistake that many card makers make. So I've attached my base here, or my card panel, onto a sticky mat or a grip mat on top of a rotating platform. It's just something that I've really enjoyed using lately for my stencils, so I can move things back and forth easily without having to turn and twist my body. So a lot of the times people will grab their embossing ink and then they will just press it through their stencil, and the results can be kind of mediocre, I'm not gonna lie. So what you're gonna do is you are going to grab a dauber instead. One of these domed ones. The flat ones are okay too. I like the domed ones because I find it'll get into all the nooks and crannies, and then you're just going to pounce it on top. You can also do sort of a twist and pounce as well if you want to kind of twist it right to left, but this is how you can ensure even coverage of your embossing ink over top of your stencils rather than just trying to smoosh it through the stencil. Let's go ahead and add our embossing powder. I'm going to be adding 3 types of powder. I'm going to be adding some yellow, pink, and purple, and I'm just sprinkling it on certain areas of the stencil, tapping it off to get rid of any excess that shouldn't be there, and then I filter it back into the jar. If you want to be on the safe side, you can use a different piece of copy paper each time or a different coffee filter. I'm really not that picky, so if I get a couple of grains of pink in the yellow jar, I don't mind at all. So I'm just going in and just implementing this and putting down the powder in random areas until the whole stencil is covered. I always forget to take out my colored embossing powders, and lately I've been playing with them more and more, and they are just so much fun, aren't they? You can create such great backgrounds. This is the wonderful Wreath stencil from Altenew, and I love how this creates a lot of white space to make a very clean, simple, easy card. So you can see I have no uneven bits on my embossing design at all. Everything went perfectly through. So if you apply your embossing ink like that, it really is great. Also, if you see any areas that aren't shiny, like that tip of that leaf, just hit them again with your heat tool. It just means that the powder hasn't set yet. I die cut the high die from the Stamp Market. This is an old die that I have in my stash that I use all the time. I love it because it has the high word and then it has the outline around it. So you can use the outline separately, the thicker letters separately. You could use them together. I think it's super versatile. And I'm going to go ahead and add, again, using my dauber here, some embossing ink. And I'm just going to ink these once again in the various colors that we used before. I think I'm just going to use pink and purple this time though. When you're applying your embossing ink, just make sure that you are not applying it to the copy paper directly, because then you're going to have a whole bunch of wasted powder. So you'll see I did it on a glass mat and then I transferred it over to the copy paper. You could also apply the ink over top of a separate piece of copy paper. It's just that if you add it onto this copy paper, then the powder will stick to it and not come off. So I'm going to go ahead and add the purple areas and then pink, and we're going to have some really great colorful outlines of these letters. I heat set those off screen. I would recommend using tweezers in a case like this for something so thin and intricate. And I'm going to add the high here to the card. I think though I am going to add the white letters to the inside. It's not necessary, but I am going to add the white letters using some foam tape to add some dimension. And just, I think it looks pretty as is though. So I could have left it. You can add it. It's completely up to you. I think that this little card would stand alone really great as a clean and simple, easy card. I decided to add a little bit of metallic paper just to help that shine of the glitter embossing powder sort of pop a little bit more. So what I did was I cut my card panel down to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. And then I cut a piece of silver cardstock to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, I think it was. And then I went ahead and just added it to a plain A2 size card base. I finished off the card with some silver pearls to help the silver cardstock shine, and I think this card turned out really lovely, super shiny and sparkly. My next example here uses the exact same technique. I just wanted to show you a very brief variation. So once again, I am adding my stencil on top of my white cardstock. I pounce my embossing ink over top. I'm not going to go through this all over again. We've already done it. And this time I added a mix embossing powder. So this is a pre-mixed embossing powder, and it means that the jar comes already with a bunch of different types of embossing powder in it. So there's no need to go in with separate colors and things like that. So this can be a little bit of an easier one. I decided to switch things up by heat embossing the entire letter here, the thicker letters rather than the thin outline, just to kind of give myself a little variation in the card. So here's a look at me putting the finishing touches on the card. So I used the really cool background, a white outline this time, and a heat embossed sentiment. And now you can see that the sentiment really pops from the background. So just another idea for you there.
Crafters may struggle with applying embossing ink evenly or believe it's too tricky to use stencils for embossing. But with the right tools like an embossing dauber or a sponge, embossing ink can be applied evenly, creating a clean, professional look with minimal learning curve.
So I decided to play around with the Joseph's coat technique, which is traditionally done with stamps, and I thought I would try this with this stencil technique. So once again, using my grip mat to help me create my card, I decided to create a really fun summery card, and I used a watermelon layering stencil. But how could you do Joseph's coat with a layering stencil and with a stencil in general? So let's create this card and I will show you how. So the idea of this is, how am I going to get a background behind these watermelons? So I could try putting this over top of colored cardstock, but that might not give me the true colors of the ink, and they might not be as vibrant as I want them to be. So how do I get color in between those watermelons? So I'm going in and I'm going to layer all the stamps the stencils as normally. I used watermelon pink for the watermelon, parsley for the rinds, and black, of course, for the seeds. You will notice that I switched from the traditional dauber to a detailed fine bristle pen because these are really, really fine details, and I just want to make sure that I can get in there and get the black ink. And I find that easiest to do with one of these really small brushes. So let's get the final look of these watermelons. They're super cute and fun. They just put you in a good mood, don't they? So what I'm going to do is, off screen, I am going to go ahead and I'm going to wash all of these stencils and make sure they're completely dry. And now what I'm doing is placing each stencil over top. I'm only going to need to do this twice, once for the watermelon part and once for the rinds, because obviously the third layer of the seeds, I'm already covering this with embossing ink. I'm just pouncing, making sure I'm not doing any sort of twisting move at all. I don't want to lift up any of that ink that I've just put down. And I am going to add the embossing ink over top of this. Once I'm finished, I'm going to remove the stencil as well as my card panel from the sticky mat, and I'm going to add some clear embossing powder over top. What's great about this with the watermelon design is that watermelons are kind of, shiny and wet looking anyway. So I think having the clear embossing powder and making them shiny on a card just makes them even more realistic looking. I am going to go ahead with my heat tool now, and I'm going to melt all of these. Now I'm going to do this in 2 layers. I'm doing this once for the watermelon part, the flesh of the fruit, and I'm going to do this for the rinds. The reason why I don't do them separately is I need to heat set the powder in order to add the next layer. So if I were to put down embossing ink on the flesh and then I were to layer my rind over top, my stencil might pull up a lot of that embossing ink over top of the flesh of the fruit, and then I wouldn't get a good impression on the clear embossing. So I did it in 2 steps. You could try doing it in 1. I think it'll be okay. So now this is all shiny, and it's also going to resist any ink over top. Now a traditional Joseph's coat would show me going over with a black or a very dark color over top of the card. In this case, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to add a fun, bright, beautiful blue. But before that, once again, just a reminder, you are going to have to go in and repeat this step with the embossing ink over top of the rinds, adding the clear embossing powder over top, and heat set it first. Now I'm free to add whatever color I'd like to the background. I'm going to pretend it's kind of like a summer sky. So I'm grabbing my blue brush here. I'm using powder ink from Concord & Ninth, which is a very, very light blue. And I'm starting in the center and kind of working my way around, debating whether I'm going to just add the blue to a certain part of the card, like the center, and work my way to the edges and get lighter and lighter, or maybe only a certain area of the card. I think in the end, going over the entire background is going to look best, but you could as well mask off areas like a diamond or a circle or a rectangle or a square to get yourself a different look if you'd like to leave some of the card still white. So I finished off the card by adding a pop of white. I die cut this with a rounded die, a rounded corner die, and then I topped it off with the Hey Friend sentiment. I think this looks really fun. So while I'm adding the silver pearls, I have a question for you. How did you like this technique? Is this something that you would consider to be too time consuming or something you're looking forward to trying? You could also try it with a single layer stencil rather than a multiple layered stencil for your first time so that you really get the hang of it if you feel like you want to get some practice first and gain some confidence before trying it with a layering stencil.
Now that you've learned how to unlock the full potential of your stencils with these heat embossing techniques, let's take things even further. Did you know that most stencils are far more versatile than we think? In my next video, I'll show you how to stretch your stencils in creative ways to get even more out of them. Turning small designs into bold backgrounds to creating unique layouts, this is a must-watch for anyone who loves stenciling. Click here to watch the video now, and let's stretch your stencils to do things you never thought were possible.